The command didn't come from a stage manager or a director. It came from the man standing alone in the center of the boxing ring at Madison Square Garden, clutching a microphone like it was the only weapon he had left. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, had just done the unthinkable. In the middle of "I've Got You Under My Skin," a song that usually ran like a Swiss watch, he had sliced his hand through the smoky air and silenced a 40-piece orchestra. 20,000 people in New York City froze. The silence in the garden was heavier than the noise had been a second before. Frank stood there, his blue eyes narrowing, staring past the blinding spotlights into the shadowy depths of the VIP section. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from the heat, but from the sudden electric realization of who had just walked into his arena. What happened next between the street kid from Hoboken and the woman who had left Hollywood to become actual royalty would become the single most elegant moment in the history of live entertainment. But nobody in that arena was prepared for the collision of worlds that was about to take place. It was October 1974, the main event. This wasn't just a concert, it was a gladiator match. Frank Sinatra was stepping back into the ring. Literally, the stage was built as a boxing ring to prove that at 58 years old, he could still knock out the world. The press had been circling him like sharks, whispering that the voice was gone, that the breath control was fading, that the old blue eyes magic had finally run dry. He needed this night to be perfect. He needed to show New York that he was still the undisputed champion. But what Frank didn't know was that the stakes were about to get infinitely higher, because a ghost from his past, a woman who represented everything he admired and everything he had lost, had just slipped past security. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? To understand why this moment stopped time, you have to understand the man standing in that ring. In 1974, Frank Sinatra was a man fighting a war on two fronts, one against the critics who said he was finished, and one against his own internal clock. He had retired in 1971, unable to bear the thought of fading away in public, only to realize that silence was louder than any booing crowd. He had to come back. The main event at Madison Square Garden was designed as a spectacle of strength. He was the heavyweight champion of song, entering the arena to defend his title. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke, cheap cologne, and the nervous energy of 20,000 New Yorkers who were daring him to impress them. But beneath the tuxedo and the bravado, Frank was terrified. He wouldn't admit it to his guys, not to Jilly Rizzo or the rest of the entourage, but the fear was there. The high notes were harder to hit. The breath didn't last as long. He had to rely on phrasing, on acting, on the sheer force of his personality to carry him through. He was shadowboxing with his own legacy. And in the middle of this high-wire act, in the chaos of the most important performance of his decade, the one person who could make Frank Sinatra feel like a jagged, unpolished stone had just walked into the room. Her Serene Highness, Princess Grace of Monaco. Decades earlier, she had just been Grace Kelly. They had starred together in high society, dancing through the mansions of Newport, the rough Italian-American singer and the ice-cool Philadelphia debutante. They were the odd couple of Hollywood. Fire and ice, grit and grace. Frank had loved her, not romantically, but as an ideal. She was the class he was always trying to buy, the elegance he tried to mimic with his tailored suits and silk pocket squares. But she was the real thing. When she left Hollywood to marry a prince, Frank had felt a strange sense of loss, as if the world had become a little less magical. He hadn't seen her in years. She lived in a palace now. He lived in dressing rooms and hotels. The distance between them wasn't just geographical. It was the distance between a street fighter and a queen. If you love stories about the legends who defined an era, make sure to subscribe for new stories. The show had started with the ferocity of a title fight. Frank came out swinging with "The Lady is a Tramp," punching the accents, moving around the canvas, working the crowd. The energy was manic. He was sweating, laughing, throwing jokes at the audience, trying to keep the momentum high enough that nobody would notice the cracks in the armor. He was winning them over, round by round. The garden was roaring. It was a New York crowd, tough, loud, and loving every second of it. But halfway through the first act, during the quiet intro of a ballad, a ripple went through the ringside seats. It wasn't a fight. Frank knew what a fight sounded like. This was different. It was a hush that spread outward like a wave. Heads were turning. Ushers were scrambling. Even the band seemed to sense a shift in the atmospheric pressure. Frank, ever the control freak, felt the distraction immediately. He hated distractions. This was his church, his ring, his night. Who had the audacity to steal focus from the chairman? He squinted against the glare of the limelights. He saw the flash of diamonds first. Then the perfect, impossible posture. Then the hair, swept back in that regal style that only one woman in the world could pull off. Princess Grace was being ushered into a seat in the third row, surrounded by a phalanx of security that made his own bodyguards look like amateurs. She wasn't just a celebrity. She was a head of state. She was protocol personified. And she was here, in the sweat and noise of the garden, watching him. Frank felt a cold drop of adrenaline hit his stomach. This wasn't just an old friend. This was a judgment. She had seen him at his peak in Hollywood. Now she was seeing him here. Older, heavier, fighting for his life under the hot lights. The insecurity that had driven him since he was a skinny kid in Hoboken flared up. Was he just a lounge singer to her now? A relic from the past? He signaled the conductor, Bill Miller. Cut it. The music died instantly. The sudden silence was jarring. The audience, confused, murmured. Frank didn't joke. He didn't make a crack about the interruption. He stood center stage, gripping the mic stand, and let the silence stretch out until it was uncomfortable. He needed to recalibrate. He needed to decide, in that split second, who he was going to be. Was he going to be the entertainer who ignored the disruption and plowed through the set list? Or was he going to be the man who acknowledged that royalty, true royalty, was in the house? He looked down at his shoes, then up at the ceiling, and finally, directly at her. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the brash New York edge and softening into something warmer, something more vulnerable. "We have to stop the fight for a minute." He walked to the edge of the boxing ring stage, leaning against the ropes. The intimacy of the gesture made the massive arena feel like a small club at 3 a.m. "You know," he continued, "I spent my whole life trying to learn how to walk, how to talk, how to hold a drink, trying to learn what they call class. I bought the suits, I bought the houses, but class isn't something you buy. It's something you are." He pointed a finger into the darkness, directly at the third row. "And tonight, the teacher is in the classroom." The crowd turned as one. When the spotlight hit her, the garden didn't just cheer. They gasped. Princess Grace stood up. She didn't wave wildly. She didn't blow kisses. She simply inclined her head, a smile touching her lips. That famous, enigmatic smile that had captivated Hitchcock and a prince. Frank could have left it there. A nice nod, a round of applause, back to the music. That's what the rulebook said. You don't upstage yourself. You don't invite comparison with perfection. But Frank Sinatra never followed the rulebook. He saw her standing there, so poised, so distant, and he hated the distance. He wanted to bridge the gap between the palace and the pavement. He wanted to show her, and show the world, that despite the titles and the tuxedos, They were still just two kids from the studio lot who made magic together. "Your Highness," Frank said, the title sounding strange in his Jersey accent, but completely sincere. "You know, the last time we danced, I stepped on your toes. I've been feeling guilty about it for 20 years. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Grace laughed too, a genuine, unguarded laugh that broke through the royal veneer. "I think I owe you an apology," Frank said, and then he did something that made his security team turn pale. He slipped through the ropes of the boxing ring. He didn't use the stairs. He hopped down onto the concrete floor of the arena, abandoning the safety of his stage, and began walking through the crowd toward her. The garden went insane. People were standing on chairs, craning their necks. Sinatra was in the aisle. He was moving through the sea of people like Moses parting the Red Sea, heading straight for the princess. The Secret Service agents around her tensed up, hands moving inside jackets, but Grace waved them off with a tiny flick of her wrist. She stepped out into the aisle to meet him. It was a tableau that no photographer could have staged perfectly enough. Frank, sweating, tie undone, the gladiator taking a break from the battle. Grace, cool, immaculate, diamonds glittering. They met in the aisle, surrounded by screaming fans, but for a moment, it was just the two of them. Frank took her hand. He didn't shake it. He bowed, deeply, theatrically, but with a reverence that silenced the immediate rouse around them. He kissed her hand, then looked up at her with those blue eyes that had broken 1,000 hearts. "Gracie," he whispered, loud enough for the mic to catch, "you make this dump look like a palace. If you are enjoying this journey into the hidden history of music legends, please subscribe for new stories." But Frank wasn't done. He wasn't going to leave her in the audience. He gestured toward the ring. "Come on, come up. The view is better from the corner." This was a violation of every protocol in the book. You don't ask a princess to climb into a boxing ring in front of 20,000 screaming New Yorkers. Her lady-in-waiting looked horrified. The security detail looked ready to have a stroke. But Grace Kelly hadn't just been a princess. She had been an actress. She knew a scene when she saw one. She knew that refusing him would be a snub, and accepting him would be a moment of pure magic. She took his arm. The image of Frank Sinatra escorting Princess Grace of Monaco up the steps and through the ropes of a boxing ring stage at Madison Square Garden is one of those images that defines the 20th century. As she stepped onto the canvas, the roar was deafening. It was a sound of pure affection. Affection for him, for her, for the era they represented. Frank signaled for a stool. He didn't want her standing while he performed. He placed the stool in the center of the ring, took off his tuxedo jacket, and placed it over the seat, a gesture of chivalry that made the women in the audience swoon. She sat, crossing her legs at the ankle, looking out at the ocean of faces with a calm beatitude. Frank grabbed the mic stand. He turned to the band. "Bill, give me Young, and keep it soft. We're in a library now." The orchestra slid into the opening chords of "You Make Me Feel So Young." But Frank didn't sing it to the audience. He sang it to her. He walked around the stool, crooning, playful, teasing. He wasn't the tired, aging fighter anymore. He was the boy next door, trying to impress the prettiest girl on the block. "You make me feel so young. You make me feel there are songs to be sung." He was phrasing the lyrics perfectly, leaning into the joy of the song. And Grace, she played her part perfectly. She wasn't stiff. She was beaming. She caught his eye, laughed at his little improvisations, tapped her hand on her knee. For 3 minutes, the boxing ring wasn't a place of combat. It was a living room. It was a private joke between old friends that 20,000 people were lucky enough to eavesdrop on. He changed the lyrics on the fly, a classic Sinatra trick. And even when I'm old and gray, well, look at me, Gracie, I'm already there, the crowd roared. Grace threw her head back and laughed. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability for Frank. He was admitting his age, his fears, his mortality, but he was doing it with such charm, in the presence of such ageless beauty, that it didn't look like weakness. It looked like triumph. As the song ended, Frank hit the final note, holding it longer than he had held any note that night, fueling it with pure adrenaline. He dropped to one knee beside her stool as the orchestra crashed the final chord. The ovation lasted 4 minutes. Frank stood up, helping Grace to her feet. He looked at the audience, his face flushed, his eyes shining. "You see?" he told the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "That's what it's all about. You can have all the hits in the world. You can sell out the Garden. But if you don't have friends who remember you when you were just a skinny bum from Jersey, you got nothing." Before we get to the final, tear-jerking moment of this night, take a second to subscribe for new stories so you never miss a legend coming to life. He didn't just let her walk away. He escorted her back to the ropes, back down the stairs, and back to her seat. He didn't rush it. He treated the walk back like a procession. When he finally climbed back into the ring alone, he looked different. The fear was gone. The desperation to prove himself was gone. He had looked into the eyes of his past, the eyes of royalty, and he had seen acceptance. He had seen love. He picked up the microphone. The setlist said the next song was a fast tempo swinger, Bad, Bad Leroy Brown. Frank shook his head at the conductor. "Scrap it," he murmured. "Give me The Way You Look Tonight." He sat on the stool where she had just sat. He touched the fabric of his jacket that was still draped over it. And he sang. He sang with a tenderness that hadn't been there at the start of the show. He wasn't singing for the back row anymore. He was singing for the memory of a time when Hollywood was golden, when he and Grace were young, before life got complicated with crowns and comebacks. The audience felt the shift. They stopped screaming and started listening. Really listening. Frank Sinatra had started the night trying to prove he was a fighter. But thanks to the woman in the third row, he ended the night proving he was a lover. He proved that the strongest thing a man can do isn't to knock someone out, but to let someone in, to show respect, to honor the people who made you who you are. As the concert ended, Frank didn't do his usual triumphant exit, running off stage with a towel around his neck. He stood in the center of the ring, looked at the third row one last time, and offered a simple, silent salute. A salute from one sovereign to another. The chairman of the board acknowledging the Princess of Monaco. It was the last time they would ever see each other in public. Grace would tragically pass away in a car accident just 8 years later. But for the people in Madison Square Garden that night, the memory would last forever. They hadn't just seen a concert. They had seen a coronation. They had seen the moment when the rough edges of New York met the polished diamonds of Monte Carlo. And they realized that underneath it all, it was just two friends saying hello. Greatness recognizes greatness. That's the lesson. Frank could have been intimidated. He could have been jealous of her status. Instead, he celebrated her. And in celebrating her, he elevated himself. He showed that true class isn't about bloodlines or titles. It's about how you treat people when the whole world is watching. We often think of these legends as statues, frozen in time. But nights like this remind us they were flesh and blood, full of insecurity and love, just like us. If this story of an unforgettable reunion moved you, and if you believe that friendship is the only true royalty, don't forget to subscribe for new stories. Now, I want to hear from you. Who is the one person from your past you'd give anything to see walk through the door right now? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, The next time you feel like you're fighting a battle alone in the ring, look out into the dark. Your friends might be closer than you think. Subscribe for new stories, and I'll see you in the next one.